All right, it is now 2 after the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today for Trauma-Informed Approaches to Adolescent Evidence-Based Programs, hosted by HCET with presenter Stephanie Hebert. My name is Jordan Murch. I'm a training manager at HCET, and I will be moderating the training today. Let me briefly introduce you to HCET, or Healthcare Education and Training. HCET's mission is to provide comprehensive program development, education, and training to improve reproductive and sexual health outcomes. HCET is an organization of passionate people who are proactive in their belief that access to evidence-based, medically accurate reproductive and sexual health education, training, and care is a fundamental right. For more information and to keep up to date with HCET events, please be sure to follow HCET on these social media platforms and visit our website at hcet.org. For additional training and professional development opportunities, visit our virtual learning website at learn.hcet.org. Next slide, please. Now I'll just quickly review some housekeeping information. A link to complete an event evaluation will be sent to you via email following this training. Your feedback is always greatly appreciated. Archived presentations and a list of upcoming events can be viewed on our website. If you have any technical difficulties during this presentation, please contact us at the email listed on your screen, updates@hcet.org. Next slide. The presenter of this training does not disclose any actual, potential, or perceived conflicts of interest. Next slide, please. Thank you. And now I'd finally like to introduce you to your presenter for today. Stephanie Hebert is a dynamic sex education specialist with over 20 years of experience in program planning, group facilitation, professional presentations, and training. With expertise in reproductive health and sex education, Stephanie has a strong working knowledge of culturally sensitive counseling skills, trauma-informed approaches to care, and gender and sexual diversity. She is passionate about creating environments and systems that support all students, families, and communities. Without further ado, I will be turning things over to Stephanie. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. I'm looking forward to it. I am with an organization called Cardia Services, and we're a national organization that really works to support folks who do the direct service that you're doing. I've been a trainer with this organization for the last 6 years full-time, and before that off and on as a consultant since 2003, so a really long time that I've been in this field. So I've been working on the trauma-informed approaches content for the last 6 years. We have a resource on our website that is a guide to trauma-informed sexuality education, and would love for you to check that out. I can give you more information on that later, and I was one of the co-authors of that guide. And so I'm super thrilled to be here with HCET to provide this content for you all in Wisconsin and Indiana. I am down in Austin, Texas, so I am a little bit warmer than where you are, but I'm glad to be here with you. All right. I like to start my trainings with a little bit of Zoom housekeeping. If you're like me, you've maybe been on Zoom every day now for 370 or so days. But I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to Zoom. So just as a reminder to keep yourself on mute when you're not speaking. I am super comfortable with, if you do have a question, you can put it in the chat box, or you can unmute and speak into the space is okay as well. Just make sure that you toggle yourself to mute and unmute when you need to. Please go ahead and rename yourself or just make sure that your name is showing on your screen, and feel free to add your pronouns if you like. If you're not familiar with that, I'll give you my pronouns are actually she, her, and hers. So that's how you would refer to me. So if you'd like to add your pronouns, feel free to do so. And I like to get started just with a little poll. I just want to check in with you all and see what all you know about this content already. Oh, did someone have a question? Destiny, I see your hand is up. Did you have something you wanted to say?
No, I'm sorry.
Okay, that's all right. All right, let's go ahead and start with a poll. So Megan, Jordan, whoever is launching that, if you can launch that first poll for me, thank you. So I'd like for you to tell me on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you know about trauma and how it impacts a person's behavior? So 1 would be nothing at all, 2 would be very little, 3 is some, but could use some additional information. 4, you know a good amount. 5, you are an expert. All right. Keep them coming. Got about 85% of you. Give you 5 more seconds. All right, let's go ahead and close that. Yeah, it looks like you all have a good amount of information. So I'm seeing that the majority of you are at a 4, and then some 3. One of you is an expert. Fantastic. You should be co-training with me. Let's talk later. All right, so then let's stop sharing that one, and we'll go to the next one. So you know about trauma and how it impacts behavior, but tell me what you know or how comfortable you are in, oh, my slides are getting ahead of me here. Hang on. How comfortable are you implementing the principles of trauma-informed care? So you know about trauma and behavior. What do you know about using trauma-informed approaches? So 1, not at all. 2, a little. 3, somewhat, but certainly need practice. 4, you feel very comfortable. 5, you are an expert at it. All right, got about 73%, 75% of you. Good. Let's give you 5 more seconds. All right, we can go ahead and close that one. Yeah, so y'all are a little less comfortable with the idea of implementing trauma-informed approaches, even though you know about the content of trauma. So most of you are in the largest number of you are in the somewhat, but certainly need practice. A few of you aren't familiar with it at all. A few of you feel pretty comfortable. So let's go ahead and stop sharing that. All right, that's great. So what I sure do wish that we had more time and ability to practice doing those interactions today. We are going to get to it at the end of the session. We're just kind of practice changing up some of the language that comes from some evidence-based interventions. But what we're mostly going to focus on is we're going to start by looking at what trauma is, or kinds of trauma, including the ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. We're going to look at how trauma impacts the developing adolescent brain, and therefore how it impacts decision making and behaviors. We're going to look at some situations that could potentially be triggering or be trauma reminders for folks, and then introduce the 6 principles that come from SAMHSA, and talk about strategies on how to actually apply those strategies to your work. So those are our objectives for today. I like to start with a content note. Obviously, this is a topic that, just due to the nature of it, we're talking about traumas. There are going to be some events or experiences that we talk about that may be emotionally challenging for you. We've certainly recognized that we all, when we talk about how common trauma is, this doesn't just mean those other people, right? We're all in this community together, and we definitely all can have experienced some traumas. So if anything kind of comes up for you, or you're feeling challenged by it, please make sure to take care of yourself however you need to. On that note, I'd like to start with a good feeling, something that feels good to you. So in the chat box, I would love for you to tell us something that is a feel-good experience for you. We're going to keep this PG-13, people, but what I mean by that is something that makes you smile, something that kind of just warms your heart. So this is my example that you see of the picture is of my dog. This was when he was at doggy daycare. This was back when we used to travel, and he was boarded with them while I was away for work. And they just sent me this lovely picture, and it just made me smile. So Let me look in the chat. So I'm seeing baking, yum, baking, riding my bike, my baby kicking. I don't know, Destiny, if that means the baby is still inside of your uterus, but man, that kicking is amazing when they are. And dog, walk with friends, family time, conversations in the car with your kids. Yep, absolutely. Succeeding at something that I was previously struggling with. Fantastic. And watching your family be happy, going for walks, online games, traveling with friend, music, sewing, excellent. Community liberation and empowerment. Yes. Wine, music, watching movies, baking, seeing the kiddo during the week, warmer weather, excellent, wonderful. Yeah. So these things make us feel good. And when I talk about it, I often say, like, we use language like it warms my heart. It gives you warm fuzzies, right? And warmth is a way that we describe how it makes us feel. And for some of us, we literally feel the warmth, right? What are some other things that we might feel? What is your body doing when you think about these experiences? Well, how does your body respond? So go ahead and put that in the chat for me as well. How is your body responding when you're thinking about your experience? Untensing or relaxing, smiling, lighter, yeah, increased energy, refreshed, relaxing, absolutely, happy, feels light, yeah. And even when we hear or read, in this case, but hear or read about someone else's positive experience, does that feel the same? Does it feel different? What do you notice in your body? Yeah, light, relaxing. I love reading or hearing about other people's feel good experiences, right? Because thinking about, oh yeah, I remember when I was pregnant and your baby kicking was just was such an exciting time. I got to remember how I felt in that moment, right? Thinking about kids, thinking about baking, thinking about sewing, even if that wasn't your answer, it still can kind of bring back some memories for you that also feel good. Right? So why are we talking about this? Well, if we're talking about experiences and thinking back to experiences that we've had in the past, we notice how it impacts our body, right? That goes for positive experiences and memories, and it also goes for the negative experiences and memories. So I like to start on that good note, but just to kind of show you how your body responds, even when you're not currently experiencing it. And that's what we need to keep in mind when we think about folks who've experienced trauma. So in order to talk about a trauma-informed approach, which is what we'll get to, we have to start on the same page in terms of defining trauma. So to talk about trauma, what are we talking about? How would you define trauma? So again, in the chat box, put in there your definition, or what is it that comes to mind for you when you think about trauma? Okay, so I see pain. ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. Insecurity. Negative life experiences, sure. Generational, that some trauma is generational, absolutely. Damage, responses to past experiences, so physical and emotional. Adverse experiences, broken, yeah, setbacks, something that negatively impacts a person. Okay, yeah. Yeah, so something hard to deal with. So in a roundabout way, if we put all of y'all's words together, y'all have basically come up with the definition of trauma, right? So this is the definition that comes from SAMHSA, or the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, which is that an individual trauma results from an event or series of events or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual or a close caregiver as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on an individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So that's the long definition from SAMHSA. But what we want you to focus on is these 3 E's of the definition. So let's break those down individually. The events, so something actual or an extreme threat of physical or psychological harm, right? So something that is life-threatening, neglect or abuse, or any variety of things. So something that happens to me or to someone in my in my sphere, my circle, my loved ones, right? That's the event, the thing that happens. And then there's the experience. No two people are going to experience an event the same way. So no two children from the same family experience the trauma that happens within that family the same way, because it's all about how we make connections in our brain, right? When we connect our current experience to past experiences, our current knowledge to past knowledge. So the way that our brains are wired are all different. So therefore our experiences are always going to be different from one person to the next. And then the third E is the effects. And this is where we're talking about long lasting effects. So I feel like, the word trauma has been in kind of overly used, right? Like we experience something, and even if it's just a bad movie and someone will say, ugh, I'm traumatized. And maybe there was some sort of trauma because of the movie, but maybe it's just something you threw out because it was a bad movie. I feel like people use the word trauma very flippantly a lot of times. And so we're talking about things that have long lasting effects. Now, oftentimes folks may not even necessarily connect the effects that their body and their mind is feeling to that actual event, right? So sometimes there's a disconnect between the effects that are happening to a person and the actual event that took place in their life. And that's okay. It's not about making the connection. It's the fact that it's there. And so we're going to talk about each of these things a little bit as we go through what trauma is. Let's start with the event. So when we say types of trauma, you can really think about this in terms of the events or the things that have happened, right? And I'm going to break them down into 4 different types. So there's acute, chronic, complex, and historical. Let's look at each of these individually. So acute trauma is a singular or short-term event, a one-off thing that happened, right? One time, not over and over or whatever, but just a one-time event. In the chat box, someone tell me what's an example of a one-time, maybe acute trauma event that you have experienced in your community or your clients maybe have experienced. Yeah, absolutely. 9/11, an act of terrorism, a singular act of terrorism like 9/11 is absolutely considered an acute trauma. We're not talking about the effects, right? We know the effects are long-term, long-lasting. Death of a family member, car accident, house fire, absolutely. Yeah, so an accident, a natural disaster, a singular act of violence or terrorism, sudden unexpected loss. So those things that you all talked about as well. Hurricane, so I'm in the South, or I'm in Texas, but I'm from Louisiana. Hurricane Katrina, this is an acute trauma. There's a lot of other things involved in the reason why Katrina was so devastating. We can talk about a lot of those other kinds of things that kind of led up to it being that devastating, but the hurricane itself is an acute trauma. Okay, let's move on to the next one, which is chronic trauma. So we're talking about repeated and prolonged exposure to violence or to traumatic experiences. So for this, we're talking about things like community or family violence, long-term illnesses that someone might experience, chronic bullying, chronic poverty, living in poverty, and all of the stressors that are related to living in poverty is considered trauma. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about why that is more when we talk about the brain in a little bit. Exposure to war or torture or forced displacement. These are all things that are ongoing issues that a person may face. And these are chronic trauma. Now, this is a little bit different than complex trauma, but it's really in addition to. So complex trauma is chronic, ongoing, prolonged, but interpersonal. So childhood trauma is what is complex trauma, right? So when there's a person who's supposed to be taking care of you, but is instead inflicting harm, that does a special kind of thing in the brain, right? Imagine those connections, or maybe you don't have to imagine, but think about those connections. This person is supposed to be taking care of me and is instead hurting me. What that does to the connections in the brain. So we're talking about physical, emotional, sexual abuse within a caregiving system, ongoing neglect by caregivers, witnessing domestic violence in the household, and other kinds of violence that you don't have support for. Now, again, this is chronic, meaning ongoing, but interpersonal, right? So that's why it's a little bit of a distinction. They're very similar, but there's a little bit of a distinction there. And lastly, we're talking about historical trauma. This one is often, I feel like this one is often neglected and not talked about as much, though it was noted in here in y'all's answers earlier in terms of thinking about the experiences in the past, generational, someone mentioned. That's what we're talking about in terms of historical trauma. Cumulative emotional and psychological wounds carried across generations that result from cataclysmic events. I don't usually write long definitions with all of these big words, but I feel like this one is super important to put out there in its full explanation. So we're talking about things that are still dealing, communities that are still dealing with systematic oppression, and these are particular groups in our society. So thinking about issues around genocide, slavery, forced relocation, destruction of cultural practices, right? So people argue, that was so long ago, right? And there are still oppressive systems that are impacting generations today. But it's not just about those oppressive systems, it's the fact that it's been carried across generations. There are good studies that show, for example, survivors of the Holocaust, their children and their children's children have higher levels of anxiety and depression. That is something that's carried generationally, right? Because of that trauma that happened 100 years ago. Wasn't 100 years ago, but that happened in the 1900s, right? So really kind of thinking about what that means over generations. So how common is trauma? So here's where I'm going to start talking about the ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. Note that adverse childhood experiences are also kind of the complex trauma, but I don't like to just talk about this because there are so many other things. You'll see why in just a moment. However, the ACEs study is the study that we have that is the best one in terms of really accounting for how common trauma is and what the long-term effects are. So adverse childhood experiences. So this was a study that began in the mid 90s, 95 to 97. It was conducted by Kaiser Permanente, and they studied about 17,000 folks in California who were on their HMO, right? So here they are, and basically insurance provider. And so they have access to everyone's health through that insurance carrier, right? And they asked these folks 10 questions, only 10 questions about the things that they had experienced in their childhood. And those 10 questions were this. There were 3 around abuse. Did you experience physical abuse, emotional abuse, or sexual abuse? They asked 2 questions about neglect, physical neglect or emotional neglect. And then there were these 5 questions about what they called household dysfunction, mental illness in the family, an incarcerated relative, a mother treated violently, substance abuse, and divorce. Remember, this was in the 90s, so this is how it was worded, and this is what they measured. Now, this study has been, even after the original data was produced, it has been ongoing, and they have added questions to it depending on who's doing that research, but these were the original 10 questions that were looked at. They were able to then compare the answers. Oh, wait, not there yet. How common is trauma is where we're at. So let's look at what they came up with. There was only 36% of this study that had not experienced any, that had 0, that didn't have any of those things. And that means there were 64% that had at least one trauma, that childhood trauma that they had experienced. So there were 26% that had one of them, 16 that had 2, 9% that had 3, 13% that had 4 or more. This should say 4 or more. But that means a good majority of folks had experienced some kind of childhood trauma, right? So this is a really, and lots of studies have gotten different numbers, but it's always kind of been more than half. So I've seen some studies that have had 75 or so % of the population that they studied that had more than one trauma. But what they were able to do with this original data was to make the connections between the number of ACEs or childhood experiences that someone had experienced or gone through, and how that might impact the neurodevelopment, right? How the brain has then wires, how it develops, and how that can potentially lead to some social, emotional, or cognitive impairments. And that can lead to the adoption of health risk behaviors, which can lead to increased numbers or proportion of disease, disability, or social problems, which can lead to early death. This was the first study that made the direct connection from trauma in childhood to early death, right? And that's why the study is such a big deal. Now, the study is flawed. And so if you take this ACEs pyramid and you start to kind of talk about things like, it doesn't even include historical trauma, it doesn't include acute trauma, it doesn't include just other forms of chronic trauma. It only really asks about complex trauma, which is partly its flaw. I mean, how those questions are worded is another issue in terms of the mother being the one who's treated violently, and that divorce in and of itself, as opposed to how the parents treated each other just because they were married, right? So it's kind of an interesting, there's a lot of things that we know now, 20 some odd years later, but not the least of which is talking about things around implicit bias and social context, race relations, racism, sexism, heterosexism, transphobia, all of the types of things that we know can impact a person's mental well-being and physical well-being was not in the ACEs study at all. So, so there's been an extended ACEs pyramid trying to account for some of that stuff that the ACEs study did not really look at. And they started with the generational embodiment of historical trauma and local context. So really kind of thinking about social context stuff that's going on. And then we talk about complex trauma or ACEs, right? And I really like the way that they've changed up the wording of this pyramid a little bit, particularly something called allostatic load. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the term allostatic load. Another way to think of this is also the weathering effect. This is particularly, or originally, the weathering effect was used to discuss the added stressors that people of color in our communities experience with the daily stressors of racism, prejudice, discrimination, institutionalized racism, and how we know that impacts it can impact mental well-being, right? We know that the immune system is not as robust when it's under stress, right? And when you have daily stressors of racism and oppression, then that's going to impact the immune system overall. And so what we know is that also impacts, and I like that they, instead of saying health risk behaviors, coping mechanisms, right? How people move through the world, how they behave can be because of this additional weathering, this allostatic load of stress that's being carried by some in our communities more than others. And that increases the burden of disease and disability, right? And that can lead to early death. So this extended ACEs pyramid tries to be a little bit more, a lot more comprehensive in terms of looking at the connection between trauma, illness, trauma and behaviors, and illness and death. And so this is the connection. All right, so let's talk about the brain. It's my favorite thing to talk about, and why those things make an impact. Why we see those connections is oftentimes because of what's happening in the brain. if you're familiar with, I don't know how familiar you are with brain development. We know that the brain is not fully developed until a person reaches about their mid-20s, right? But what you may or may not know is that the brain develops from kind of a bottom-up process. When babies are first born, you know, they struggle to even regulate their body temperature. That's why even in the South in the summer, you still wrap them up in little baby burritos, because you want to make sure that you keep them nice and warm, because their body can't quite do that yet. And that's a brain stem. That's a base brain. Some people call that lizard brain, right? That's the survival brain type that's not even quite fully developed yet in infancy. So body temperature, heart rate, blood pressure, sleep. This is why babies don't sleep, you know, very, very sound. When we say sleeping like a baby, it's just a ridiculous phrase, because babies don't sleep, right? So they wake easy. So just kind of thinking about those base brain survival. Babies, you know, babies sleep, they eat, they poop, they cry. That's all they do. And that's all about survival. They're not thinking abstractly. They're not manipulating. They're not trying to control the adults in their lives. They just know survival. That's all their brain knows. So that's what they're doing. Sorry, dog. Okay. Motor regulation kinds of stuff. Sorry, the dog. I'll go outside in a minute. Their brain has to develop and learn those pieces. Oh my gosh. So as they...
It's all right. It is all right.
The back door is open for a reason. Hold, please. One moment. Sorry. Okay. Get back to the brain. So as the brain develops, as they grow, it goes from the survival brain to that, you know, all the way up to the prefrontal cortex, which is more of that abstract thought, decision making, processing type of functioning that it can do. So I really love the this imaging. These are images from MRIs that look at different types of different age brains, and you can really see that the blue purple area is the more mature. There's more connections that are being made, that have been made already, more paths that have been worn in different parts of the brain. So you can still see that this frontal part of the brain is still, in a 5-year-old, very immature, starting to do more of in the preteen, but still in that yellow red up here in a preteen. The teenager is still quite green in the front, and even the 20-year-old is not fully developed in those frontal sections, right? So we know it from their behavior. We can see it from the things that they are learning and doing, but it actually shows that in brain function imaging as well. Okay, so the part of the brain that is engaged when we're in a dangerous or traumatic situation is, there are several parts of the brain, but the main one in charge is the amygdala, right? The amygdala is the big one that's in charge of survival. And as I mentioned before, the frontal part of the brain is all of those other things: the decision-making, rational thinking, abstract, you know, being able to really kind of weigh things out. What we know is that when the amygdala is in play, when the amygdala is sensing danger, it cuts off communication to that frontal cortex, right? If I come across a saber-toothed tiger out in the woods, because, you know, as you do, you don't need to think through, wait a minute, aren't saber-toothed tigers extinct? Like, why is this real? You don't have to think, is this real? You just think, I'm in danger, right? Molly, you in danger, girl. Look, like, this is a moment. Sorry, any ghost, anyone? Okay. So your brain goes into protection mode, and it doesn't let the frontal lobe cortex have access to any energy, to any firing, because it's not needed right then. Now, think about a developing brain, right? Our brain develops based on experience. When we do something, we learn something from it. Everything we do, we learn from, whether that be walking, talking, standing up and leaning on the back of a chair. We know that's gonna, we know that's gonna fall over. A toddler doesn't know that's gonna fall over, but we as adults do, right? Our brain learns on experience. Now, when a child is experiencing trauma on a daily basis, their amygdala is in charge. When their amygdala is in charge, the frontal cortex cannot experience things because it cannot be accessed because the amygdala is in charge. So the more trauma a child experiences, we've also seen on imaging, MRI imaging, that folks who've experienced a lot of childhood trauma, their amygdala is actually larger than average because it's being used so often. And then the top of the brain doesn't get practice. And so that can lead to some lifelong issues around decision making, right? Because that's the front part of the brain, the top part of the brain. See the connection there? So we know that the amygdala can be in charge. Now let's think about this in terms of what does it mean for the amygdala to be in charge. I'm going to play a little video, just a little GIF video. I just want to kind of give you a little warning. Just it's a car coming towards you. But I just want you to watch this video, and then we're going to talk about it. It's just real quick. All right, that's it. Truck moving at you. One more time. All right. Watching that clip, what happened in your body? Put that in the chat box for me. What happened to your breathing? What happened to your heart rate? What happened to your muscles? What happened to your body when you watched that clip? Yeah, held your breath, your stomach lurched, tried to move, muscles tensed, heart started racing, right? Yeah, we all know that that truck wasn't about to drive off your computer screen and hurt you in any way, shape, or form. Our front brain, our top brain knows that logically, right? Our amygdala still responded slightly to just seeing that truck drive toward us that we are in no danger from, right? This is also known as, or can be talked about in terms of amygdala hijack, right? Our frontal cortex knows logically we're not in danger. The amygdala is like, whoa, you might be in danger. Okay, so amygdala hijack. Imagine living in a constant state of amygdala hijack, of the amygdala being in charge. And that might look something like this, right? So thinking about all of the ways that the amygdala makes people feel. So now we're really starting to talk about the effects, right, of this, of experience and trauma. So feelings of hopelessness, nightmares, flashbacks, startle response, shame, self-hatred, panic attacks, emotional overwhelm, how we cope with that. Eating disorders, substance use, self-destructive behaviors, hypervigilance, right? So always looking over your shoulder. Where's the next dangerous element coming from? Everybody's out to get me, right? I really love this quote. It actually comes from a very, a much older journal article from 1990 even, but trauma survivors have symptoms instead of memories. This isn't about remembering a trauma. This is about your body responding to what it perceives as danger, regardless of if it is in danger or not, right? When your students are in your care, they are not in danger in that moment, right? Their brains may still perceive danger even when they are not. It's not about memories. It's about symptoms. It's what their body, it's what their brain is doing. And that can make it really difficult to cope with the stressors of everyday life, right? I mean, anytime you've got added stress, y'all listen, when you think about this past year of living in a pandemic, even just that constant fear of this virus makes it harder to cook dinner for your children, makes it harder to get work done, makes it harder to, because you just have, it makes it harder to cope with everyday stressors when you're under a constant level of fear. It makes it harder to trust others, to benefit from relationships. Thinking about our students, and even for yourself in this past year, memory, attention, thinking, like, you know, there are some days that I'm like, I have no idea what we just talked about in that meeting. I don't know. It makes it harder to regulate behavior, because behavior is controlled by the upper brain, right? And if my amygdala is in charge, my upper brain is not. And controlling the expression of emotions. All right, this, as I mentioned before, folks may not be in actual danger, but it doesn't mean that they don't feel like they're in danger. So here's a good way to think about perceiving and interpreting information that's coming at you. If you take a look at that image real quick, going off, look at it again real fast. Is that a snake or a stick? Was that a snake? Was it a stick? Right? We have to make split decisions sometimes. And I gave you a little bit more time to look at that than maybe you even would have been in person. One person said snake, one person said stick. Yeah, this is actually a stick. But if you are on a hike, if you're walking out in the woods somewhere and you see this, what are you going to do? You're going to stop just for a second. You might flinch and look twice at it, right? Because it's important for our safety if our brain sees danger first. Because if you're wrong, it's just like, no, it's fine. You're a little embarrassed, but you're safe. If you think, safe, and you're wrong, then you could be dead, right? So it is safer for all of us if our brain reads danger and then corrects it. When you have experienced trauma and your amygdala is in charge, you're much more likely to read safe situations as dangerous, right? So it impacts how your brain is perceiving, interpreting information. So they're more likely to read danger regardless of what's going on. So oftentimes we can be with someone and all of a sudden they're like angry and you're like, what just happened? Right? Their brain maybe just told them they were in danger. So let's talk about that, because that's because of trauma triggers or reminders of trauma. These are events or occurrences or something that kind of reminds our brain, right? So it's not even necessarily conscious. It might be, oftentimes it's unconscious, but we all of a sudden feel the same kind of distress that we felt when we experienced an original trauma. And these are often triggered by one or more of the five senses. So thinking about things that people have seen, they heard, they smelled, that they touched, or they tasted. Those are the things that may trigger trauma. So let's look at each of these a little bit individually. Sight. What are some things? Tell me in the I'm just seeing the chat box. Sorry. Tara's like, I'm gonna push the person in front of me and book it the other way if I see that stick. Yeah, no, that's fair. Okay, sight. What are some things that a person might see that might remind them of a trauma? So in the chat box, tell me some things that people might see that might be triggering for them. What are some sights? So yeah, they might see their abuser, the person who abused them, a car crash, fast movements if they can't tell. That's right. An angry person, a swastika. Yeah, definitely. A weapon. Absolutely. Yeah. So the physical resemblance, not just the abuser, but just someone maybe who physically resembles their abuser. Movies or TV shows or something with violence in it. Objects that maybe were used in abuse, specific holidays or locations where abuse took place. All right, what are some sounds? What are some things we might hear? A family having fun together might be something that you see. It might also be something you hear. People yelling, music, sirens, loud noises, a song. Yeah, absolutely. Door opening, closing. Yeah, so anything, right? Raised voices, arguing, loud noises, bangs, thumps, thunder, screams, crying, words of abuse. These can all be things that remind us either on a conscious or unconscious level. What are some smells? What are some things that people might smell that remind them? Think about smells. Cleaning products, burning, cologne, perfumes, smoke, foods, breath, fire, alcohol. Absolutely. Tobacco, alcohol, other drugs, perfume, hair product, food cooking, wood burning, right? If any, I'm gonna show my age a little bit and just mention Aquanet. Anybody, right? So like all I have to do is mention the name Aquanet. You're not even smelling that. You know what it smells like, and you remember where you were when you smelled it, right? That stuff was strong. So yeah, any kind of weird smells. We are very connected. Our nose is very connected to our memory. Okay, touch. Now this can be any kind of physical touch or just standing too close, right? So touch is just touch, but it can be any kind of touch. It could also be the feel of fabrics, certain fabrics on our skin, right? Or pressure of some kind, weight of some kind, right? And then there's taste. So taste can be certain foods or drinks. The only other thing for taste, which can also be under smell, would be blood. Right? So the taste of blood, the smell of blood could be things that also remind folks. Now we know that when we are actually in danger, that it is super important for our body to respond in a way that gets us to safety. So our pupils dilate, our body shakes, our skin flushes because the blood goes from the outside to the inside where it needs to protect our organs, right? Or it goes to the outside so that we can fight. It might go to our hands. We start to sweat. We start to, our heart races. All of that is all in terms of getting us ready to either fight or flee. And sometimes that causes us to freeze. But then the fourth F that I want to talk about is fawning. So there's fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Let's look at each of these four Fs. Obviously fighting is the most obvious one. We might see someone get angry, lash out, blaming others for anything that they've done wrong, right? They blame others for anything bad that maybe happened. The fight or fleeing, that actually might look like hyperactivity, right? So that, darting eyes, trying to find a way to get out. Oh, like I'm just going to be on my phone over here and I'm going to ignore everything else that's happening. I'm just going to flee from that. Addictions are also potentially a flight response, trying to get away from the pain, trying to get away from the memories. Anxiety and panic disorders can be because of that flight response that the body is doing. And this may seem, someone who tends to respond in flight may kind of appear to be stuck in an on mode, right? Super busy, whether that means like I have to clean all day long, I have to run, I have to stay busy, I have to do 50,000 different extracurriculars, right? That can be a flight type of response. The freeze is kind of the opposite of that. That can be stuck in the off mode, right? Detached, hide out and daydreaming, or TV watching, or video game playing, right? I'm just going to turn everything off so that I don't have to feel it and I don't have to remember it. The last one is fawn. So fawning is that way to protect yourself that is giving up all of your own needs and rights and boundaries in order to keep others happy. So this is often from children who have learned that they need to, like children who've been experienced this complex trauma from their caregivers may have had to keep them happy all the time. They know that it doesn't help to ask questions. Don't talk back, right? So I'm going to learn that as long as I cook and clean and do whatever it is that you need, then I'm going to be able to mostly avoid the abuse, right? So then that can come out for everybody else as well. So I'm going to be perfectly amenable to everything the teacher wants, to everything, my boss wants, to everything my friends want. Yeah, I'm just going to go along to get along because I don't want anybody to be upset. That's the fawning response. And it's a really, really very common one, and one we don't talk about a whole lot because it's not necessarily attached to, fight and flight we've got down. We can talk about all the body responses, but fawning is a little bit different. All right, like I said, either way, all of this is something that may seem impulsive or out of touch to you, but their brain is telling them they're in danger and they're responding to that brain, that internal stimulus, right? That's what folks are responding to. Okay. Hey, we are a good bit in. We're going to get to the sexual health or the adolescent health kind of stuff here, because we can connect the trauma to behaviors. Then we know that it absolutely also impacts things around sexual behavior. Folks who have had a history of trauma exposure are more likely to engage in higher risk behavior, whether that be substance use or sexual debut, to multiple partners, to just any variety of things. And in fact, this is a little bit of an older, I think it's 2011, and this comes from is it Pathways RTC? They're out of Portland, but I really like this. If you can't see it, I'll explain it a little bit. But basically what they're saying is populations that have experienced greater rates of trauma. So youth that are in corrections or involved in the juvenile justice departments, if youth that have developmental disabilities, youth that are in foster care, homeless youth that are experiencing or have experienced homelessness, LGBTQ youth with mental health conditions, and youth who've experienced sexual abuse, we see that they are all over the board. Lower likelihood to use birth control and condoms, much more likely to have multiple partners, have a pregnancy involvement, to experience sexual abuse, sexual activity. STI rates are higher. Substance use during sex is higher all across the board. Survival sex is higher, dating violence we know is higher in LGBTQ youth. Now, I want to give a little caveat with this. These are just based on the studies that exist or that existed at this time, which was back in the mid 2000s, right? So it doesn't mean that youth in corrections don't experience higher rates of dating violence. It just means it wasn't part of the study, or they didn't have a study on it. I'd venture to guess that all of these populations experience all of this. And they tend to have an earlier age of sexual debut as well, right? So this isn't news to you, right? But just think of this as associated with trauma, right? And think about the way that these institutions, correction institutions, foster care institutions, can also exacerbate or trigger those traumas. All right. So a good deal in, let's talk about trauma-informed approaches. What does it mean to even be trauma-informed? This definition I really like actually comes from NASDAD, which is, I'm blanking on what the letters stand for, but basically it's HIV service providers throughout the country. But I like it because it really highlights that being trauma-informed is not about an individual thing that you do. It's about an approach to administering services. It's organizational wide, and it acknowledges that traumas may have occurred or may be active in the lives of your clients, your students, whoever it is you're working with, and the way that traumas can manifest physically, mentally, or behaviorally. All right. So SAMHSA defines it with talking about the 4 R's. So a trauma-informed program, organization, or system is one that realizes the widespread impact of trauma, recognizes the signs and symptoms. By the way, this is not just in your clients or your students, but also in their families and in your staff. responds by fully integrating this knowledge into policies, procedures, and practices, and actively resists re-traumatization. Again, we're going to talk here about the different strategies that individuals can do, but you have to look at it as an organization, system, program wide, how this can impact the people that you serve. Okay, SAMHSA's 6 principles: safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender issues. And this last one is about recognizing the disproportionate rates of trauma that certain communities experience just for being who they are. All right. How does this apply to sex ed? So I just want to say really quickly, so SAMHSA is sort of the leader in, I mean, a lot of folks and through the years, a lot of entities have come up with their own trauma-informed approaches. SAMHSA is sort of the leader and has been a leader in this in terms of substance use and substance abuse, and really working with folks in their model of care. And what we've done is taken their principles and talked about how it applies to when you're providing sex education. What might that look like? So we always talk about creating safe spaces, right? This is a safe space. We want to make sure that it's a safe space for our youth to share, to learn. What does that actually mean? Right? And how do we know? If I feel safe, does that mean you feel safe? Not necessarily. So how do we know? And so a few tips around safety. So the very first thing is that environment. So making sure that the signage is I mean, right, physical environment, even down to the signage, is welcoming. Using the correct names and pronouns for folks, super important. Using that LGBTQ inclusive language. Regardless of who's in your class, not just because you know you have a gay person in your class, but especially when you don't know that you do. Using inclusive language all the time. Being very mindful of your tone, your voice, your volume, your body language, down to clear and easy access in and out of the room. If you're standing in front of the door and they have to get past you to get out of the door, right? That maybe doesn't feel very safe for them. Okay, being consistent and predictable. Folks who've experienced trauma often have felt like it's going to come out of nowhere. That's why the hypervigilance. That's why I have to always be on the lookout, be very consistent and predictable. This may also look like rituals or routines. You come in, you do a check-in thing, then we do content, then we do this game, then you have an exit ticket. Those routines can be super important. Using non-shaming, non-blaming, and non-violent language. Look, there are lots of things that we say, particularly in the sex ed world, that are shaming and blaming, and we don't even realize it. So we really need to be very mindful of that. Ensuring privacy and confidentiality. We know that you can't control what their friends are going to necessarily say to other people. We always talk about confidentiality in our group agreements, but we really need to make sure that we are adamant about what's learned here, what's said here stays here. Right? And what does that mean? That applies to me too. That means that you don't need to be talking to your coworkers about it even, right? Because if they overhear that, then they're not going to be able to trust you. And you being very upfront about what's reportable. That's not that bullet, but what's reportable and who you have to report things to and why. Okay, interrupting and addressing bullying on the spot. Don't let it happen, and address it immediately. Being mindful of how you discuss sex and choice, examining your own attitudes and values, because they will come out. Your values do come out when you don't examine them. Be prepared with handling disclosures. I'm guessing, I don't know your roles, but most of us are mandated reporters when we're working with young people. So we do have to make sure that when something is disclosed, what's my process for handling it, and how do I tell them how I'm going to handle it? And have a plan in place for when someone is triggered. Note that might look like violence, right? It might look like they're acting out, but how are you going to handle it when you think of it as potentially triggered, as opposed to just being unruly? Okay. Transparency and trustworthiness. How do the people that you work with trust you? How do you know? How can you help to ensure that they will trust you? right? So I've talked about this a little bit. Let me just say that everything in safety is the biggest one. And everything we're doing is to help ensure safetiness. So some of the stuff I've already said is about being transparent, but it is also to ensure safety. So being upfront about confidentiality and reporting. Provide current medically accurate information. So I don't know what funding sources you're under, but what we typically say in sex education is that abstinence only funding tends to be less current and medically accurate, and therefore it's harder for that to be trauma informed, right? Giving young people all of the information about ways they can keep themselves safe lets them choose what's going to be best for them and helps them to trust you that you're being open and honest with them, right? And there are some abstinence only programs that do that, but most don't. And so that's just something to, again, I don't know your funding sources, but that can be a challenge. And so that's important for you to discuss amongst yourself how you're going to make sure that you're giving students all of the information, depending on your limitations. Answering all their questions truthfully, providing that information, letting them know what's coming up next, right? So that they can prepare for it. Peer support. We know that young people learn from each other. This is what they're supposed to be doing. Their brains it's developmentally appropriate for them to be sort of pulling away from adults being in charge, right? They're getting to where they're about to leave home, or they're about to have to, go into the world on their own. They have to trust their peers. And in order to do that, they have to practice learning from and teaching their peers. And so really thinking about letting them addressing community norms is super important, and myths that abound in the community, but also helping them ask questions of each other and answering each other's questions and getting the information for each other and helping with tasks, right? That's a really big thing that is developmentally appropriate for them. Collaboration and mutuality. So this is about leveling the playing field. This is about, you are not the boss. I mean, you're in charge of their safety, sure. I often tell my own kids, look, I am legally responsible for keeping you alive. So that's why this is the rule, right? Because otherwise I get in trouble. You're in charge. However, you are not the experts in their lives, right? So seeing them as the experts in their lives helps to level that power differential. You are not telling them what to do. You are giving them information and letting them choose what's going to be right for them. Empowerment, voice, and choice. People who have experienced trauma have had their voice and their power continually taken away from them. So the whole word empowerment sort of bugs me in the way that we use it often. We often use it as we are going to empower the young people. No, we're not, because to empower means that we're giving them power. We don't give them power. They have power. We have to give them an opportunity to use their power, right? I am not in control of their power. I'm not. But I am in control of the opportunities that they may or may not have sometimes. Not always, but I am in control of some opportunities. So I need to give them an opportunity to use their voice so that they feel their power, i.e., they feel empowered, right? So we do that by validating their strengths and their resilience, by seeing them as the experts, by encouraging them to ask questions, to practice through role plays, and to really be engaged in the learning process. Okay, this also means really very explicitly addressing consent. This is not about refusal skills, right? When we focus on refusal skills in a sex ed program and we talk about all the ways to say no, here's how to say no, here's, you got to say it assertively, you got to say it with your body language, you got to say it with your words, you got to say it with your actions, right? Here's how you say no. If something happens to them, is it their fault because they didn't say no? Right? If we only teach how to say no and something happens, then it stands to reason that maybe it's their fault if they didn't say no right. Maybe I didn't say it clear enough. And that's not okay. We also need to teach how to read and respect no. It's really important that we talk to young people about using their voice, but also reading body language. because sometimes people aren't going to say no with their mouth, but they're saying it with their body. And we have to be sure that we're also paying attention to that. That is a skill that adolescents and a lot of adults don't have. And we all need to practice it. So really kind of explicitly addressing that helps to make sure that folks feel powerful. All right. Lastly, cultural, historical, and gender issues. This really comes down to working to actively move past your own stereotypes and biases. We all have biases, every single one of you. I don't know you, but I know me, and I know people, and we all have biases. That's because our brain has to have boxes. I love doing trainings or discussions around biases. So our brain makes boxes, right? Like, I know that this is an aluminum can. I know what to expect. I know it's going to make noise. I know it can be crushed. I know it's going to stay cold. I know how to keep it cold. I know because there's a box in my brain for aluminum can. I know what this chair is going to do and that it's got wheels on it. So what it's not going to do, right? And how it's going to roll around depending on what kind of floor I'm on. Those are all boxes that my brain has developed over time. And they're important because they help us filter all the information that we take in every millisecond that we look around our environment, right? Boxes are important. They're also limiting and they're also wrong sometimes, right? So we put a lot of people in boxes because our brain does it naturally. And we don't even know those boxes are there until we do something that offends someone because we didn't realize that it was because of a bias, right? We all have biases, otherwise known as boxes. They're important, but they're dangerous and they're limiting. So you have to address them. And don't just say, you know, we have an anti-discrimination policy. Great. How do you enforce it? Great. What does it look like? What does discrimination look like in your organization? How does it play out on a daily basis? How are the people of color in your organization feeling about it versus the people who were white, right? Like, what does that actually look like? And addressing those things actively, they make people uncomfortable, but you got to talk about it. Because if you don't, your students are going to feel it too. Okay, sorry, soapbox. I like this thing about considering choices within the context of their lived experience. Youth, people in general, we're going to make choices based on our own experiences, based on our own context, not based on yours, not based on what you did, not based on what you expect them to do, but what I've experienced, right? So you really have to think about it that way. We have to listen to the young people in our lives and we have to believe them, right? Believe them. Make sure that you're linking them to culturally proficient services, right? So you have to do your research. If you've got any kind of referral system that you're doing, you got to do your research and make sure that they're also youth friendly, making sure that they're also culturally appropriate in terms of race, gender, sexual orientation, and any of the other identities that students carry with them. All right. That was a lot. That was a lot. I'm going to go really quickly through just some examples of messaging, and then we're going to get to actual language that's in some EBIs and think about how we can adapt that language. All right, so I'd like to start with a couple of things that are so blatant that we all know better. I was going to say. Anybody know where this is from? Don't have sex because you will get pregnant and die. Mean Girls, yeah. So this is the ultimate, no, right? This is what we say don't do. Now, most of us, hopefully you are never saying anything like this in any of your programs. But what are the subtle messages that we are giving that say the same thing, right? Don't have sex because you will get pregnant and you will die. What about this? It's my future. I want to be an engineer. Sex can wait. What's the message? What is the underlying message from this billboard, which is what this was? What's an underlying message that people are getting from this? Yeah, if you have sex, you can't be an engineer. You can't be an engineer and have sex, right? Now listen, I'm going to assume that everybody on this call, you are in your career, you are thriving, you are, doing a bang up job at being an awesome whatever you are in your career, right? Now think about all of your amazing colleagues that you work with. Maybe you or someone else you work with had sex as a teenager. Oh, can people not be successful even though they've had sex as a teenager? Yeah. Yeah. Right? Now we are so scared to tell them that you can still be successful even if you have sex as a teenager, because we think it's giving them permission to have sex as a teenager. But here's the thing, they know it. So when we tell them you cannot be successful if you have sex as a teenager, what they hear from us is a lie. You got to think about what your messaging is. Do we want them to wait because we know that there are complications that can make it more difficult for them to be successful? Absolutely. But we cannot tell them that you cannot have sex or else you won't be able to be an engineer and you won't be able to be successful, because that's absolutely not the truth. Right? So we really have to be thoughtful about the messages that we're giving them. What about these? What do you see when you see these posters? What do you read? What do you hear? Blame, negativity. Yeah, I'm twice as likely not to graduate high school because you had me as a teen. Data is important, man. We use data, and it's important to use the data because our programs need to be influenced by data. We know that children of unintended pregnancies and teenagers are less likely to graduate high school, but it's not just the act of having a baby as a teenager that causes that. It's all of the continued issues that stem from that, right? So if I'm just blaming, you had me as a teen, so therefore it's your fault. It's not my fault. It's not the system's fault. It's not anybody else's fault. It's not, it's just your fault because you were a teenage parent. I mean, it's a scare tactic at the least, I'd say, Destiny, right? It's not effective, and it is potentially harmful and hurtful to folks who do have kids as teenagers or were the child of a teen pregnancy, right? Unplanned pregnancy. Chances are he won't stay with me. Look, we don't know, right? We know statistically, but statistics are statistics. They don't tell me at all what my partner is going to do and what I might do with my partner. They just don't. So it's not going to mean anything. And all it's doing is trying to tell you that you're stupid and you don't know what you're talking about. Okay. What about this one? For these two, what do you read? What do you see? What do you feel? Disempowered, Britta says. Tell me more about that, though. What does that mean to be disempowered? What else do you notice about these ads? I have so many thoughts about these ads. Yeah, like being a mom is a bad thing. Look, I can change diapers and change the world. Don't even. I have changed a lot of diapers in my life. I'm gonna still change the world. Having babies sucks, right? So this is exactly right, Tammy. It sends a message that you can't be a world changer or glamorous with a baby. But here's the thing about these images. Also, be super sexy and enticing, right? Like that's my sexy face. Sorry, it's not a very good one. But look, you know what I'm saying, right? Is why I'm single. I can't understand. Anyway, but there's, be sexy, be alluring, be very glossy, but don't have sex and don't have a baby because your life will suck. Right? Like this stuff is just, it's ridiculous. Be sexy, don't have sex. Mixed messages much, right? Yeah, it's not okay. I understand what they're trying to say, but it's not okay. It's not sending the right messages. Okay. Let's look at language that actually is in, oh, we're at about our time, right? So Megan and Jordan tell me we're about at time, but I've got a few more things that I want to cover and then we'll be done, right? We're at 75 minutes, but do I have time to get through a few of these?
Yeah, you're good. We just want to leave some time for questions. And if there's questions after that people still have that didn't get answered, we can send them to you via email as well and follow up that way.
Perfect. So this language comes from the language that I'm going to show you. The original language does come from EBIs. Though granted, some of these EBIs have been updated or whatever, so this may not be exact language, or you might be using these EBIs and looking and go, I recognize that language. Either way, here's the first one. Don't be embarrassed to buy condoms. Getting pregnant or an STI is even more embarrassing. Why do we want to change this? What's problematic about that language? Feel free to unmute and speak into the space if you would like, if it's faster for you, or type. It shames those who have gotten pregnant because it's embarrassing to get pregnant. People might already have an STI. Stigmatizing STIs. We're saying it is embarrassing. Oh, how embarrassing for you to have had a pregnancy or an STI, right? Stigma, absolutely. How might you possibly reframe this statement? So if this is in the curriculum that you are teaching from, how might you say this differently? Yes, absolutely, Sheila. I also have an issue with telling people how to feel. Absolutely. Don't tell me not to be upset. Look, I'm gonna be upset. So what's another way that this message about the embarrassment that a lot of people feel around buying condoms, how can we restate this? Okay, so nothing is or nothing should be embarrassing about practicing safe sex, because a lot of people certainly do feel embarrassment to go to a store and buy condoms, for example. Buying condoms is an act of responsibility, sure. Yeah, so that's those two similarly is how what I have in mind. So it is important to work through feelings of embarrassment, because you may have those feelings of embarrassment and it's okay, but it's important to work through them because it is the responsible thing to do for you and your partner, to be able to protect yourself and your partner, right? Perfect. Okay. Next one. Yeah, feel free to start sending questions in the chat if you have them already. Here's another thing that we might want to think about. The only way a female can get pregnant is if sperm cells enter her vagina and fertilize one of her egg cells. What's wrong with this one? Why might we want to change this? This one might throw you off a little bit. It does invalidate fertility treatments, although a lot of adolescents aren't typically going through fertility treatments, but it's not inclusive language. Not every female can get pregnant. Not only females get pregnant. Like, wait, what? Right? Sometimes men have vaginas and women have penises. What? Yeah, right? So we're talking particularly about trans or non-binary identified folks. So how do pregnancies occur? Is it just when a female egg meets a male sperm? No, it's actually just a person who can get pregnant. So the only way, and again, this is the only way a person can get pregnant is if a sperm cell enters the vagina, fertilizes an egg cell, and then that fertilized egg implants into the uterus. There doesn't need to be any mention of gender. There is no mention of gender here. It's a person with a vagina, right? An egg cell and a sperm cell. Now, I love Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you so much. If you let us know if you have questions. I love the, there are a handful of curricula that teach like reproductive anatomy and whatnot without using the words male and female at all. And this can be done. It does take practice. And I guarantee your students will not notice that you didn't even do it, right? You'll notice because you're working at it. But once it becomes natural, then they don't even notice that you're not saying male and female because they know what you're talking about. And they know if you're talking about them or not. And that's what matters, right? Is how they see themselves in here. People who have penises and sperm are going to know that they're the ones whose sperm might meet with someone else's eggs. And that's what's important. All right, here's another one. If you're going to have sex, you have to worry about unintended pregnancy and sexually transmitted diseases, including HIV. What's an issue with this? Why might we want to change this one? What's the problem? Okay, you should be aware it is fear-based. Makes it sound scary. Yeah, it's this you have to worry about piece, right? It creates worry, right? It's telling you that if you have sex, it's going to be very scary and worrisome. All right, so how might we want to reframe this? Seems like it's just directed toward females. Yeah, I mean, oftentimes, you're right, Tara, oftentimes this stuff, especially around pregnancy prevention, is geared toward female identified folks or people that have uteruses. How about if you're going to have sex, it's important to think about unintended pregnancies and STIs. It's important to think about those things, right? So if you don't think about them, then you may not be prepared ahead of time to prevent them. It's important to think about them. It can be important. It's important to talk to your partner about it. Yeah. Okay. Last one. It's never a good idea under any circumstances to have sex with someone you don't know very well. Why might we want to change this? Don't know. How might we change it? Yeah, it certainly could be re-traumatizing around a sexual assault survivor for sure. It feels judgmental for someone who may have done this, Tammy, because it is judgmental, right? So here's my reframe. Just delete this sentence. Listen, this is a thing that we are telling people what to do and not to do. And never in the history of adolescence has telling them what to do ever been successful, right? I mean, seriously. So you can certainly acknowledge that when you have sex with people you don't know very well, sometimes it can make it harder to have conversations and you don't know their history and you don't know what they may or may not have, but they may not know what they may or may not have, right? And so it can be a challenge, but it's never a good idea to tell people to not do something under any circumstance, right? And then, yeah, absolutely, it's judging and potentially problematic for those who've experienced sexual assault by someone they didn't know very well, right? Okay, general guidelines. It's important to avoid should and shouldn't. We don't need to should on people, right? Anytime you're thinking about should and shouldn't, you got to rethink about how you're going to say that. Avoid always and never, because life is not black and white. This is complex human behavior. Sexual behavior is complex human behavior. Rarely, if ever, is there an always or never. It just isn't how the world works. Really think through the things that are scare tactic-y, STI shaming, any kind of pregnancy or parenting shaming. Be matter of fact, normalize without judgment. Super supportive, be super supportive of youth voices. Let them speak, act on it, hear from them, consider their lived experiences. Consider things around social determinants of health or trauma, really thinking about that as opposed to the individual behavior. Be inclusive of gender and sexual diversity, etc. Okay. I know we just have 4 more minutes, so let's try to leave 5 minutes. How about 4 questions? I am done. This is a lot of content. What questions do you have for me?
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And everybody feel free to either put your questions in the chat box or you can come off of mute as well, whatever you're more comfortable with. I did have one come in to me privately that I can start sharing with you, Stephanie. This one was, and by privately, I just mean through the chat. It's available for everyone. How do you recommend responding if youth disclose trauma in front of you and their classmates?
That is a great question. So my go-to is usually to say something like, that sounds like something really tough that you've experienced. Thank you for trusting me with that information. And people respond in different ways, and maybe that's something you and I can talk about after our session is over. But anytime someone discloses, whether it's trauma or a personal experience, right? Maybe it's just about a party that just happened or, whatever. It's that, if it's a personal trauma like that, again, like I said, my favorite go-to is that sounds like it was something super difficult for you. I'm sorry you experienced that, and I appreciate your trust and sharing that. And then generalize it, third person. Unless you're talking to that individual in private, try to not make it about them, right? Because we don't necessarily need everybody in the group looking at this person who has shared something and making it about therapy for this person. A lot of people unfortunately have experienced that. And there's a lot of different ways of things that people can do, right? Here's some hotlines, here's some information to reach out if anybody has experienced or knows somebody who's experienced this, and really then turn it into a generalization and then follow up with that person one-on-one.
Thank you, Stephanie. Another question just came in. It says, can you recommend some literature about fawning? That is a fairly new term for me and I would like to learn more.
Yeah, not really, no. I don't have any off the top of my head. But there's a lot of articles out there on some mainstream media stuff. I found a really good article on Medium actually.com. I've seen some stuff on HuffPost about it. The psychologist, is that what he is, that I got some information from his website, it's a horrible website and he's super academia, and so it's not super user friendly. But he'll be kind of called the father of the sort of coining the term fawning. It's Peter something. God, no, I'm terrible. I'm sorry, have any detailed resources for fawning, but there is some stuff out there if you Google it. I should have more resources. Apologies for that.
No worries. That's also something we can follow up with later. It looks like we are just about at time. Does anyone have any other questions, comments? It looks like Kara, thank you. Put something in the chat about fawning. Appreciate
I did see some stuff on, yeah.
We can also send this link out that Kara put in the chat to the follow-up email after this presentation.
Great.
I don't know if you see that question, Stephanie, about Googling fawning.
I could do. Seems like a trauma response. So would that be a closed Google search they could do? I don't quite understand the question, but it's sort of it's a behavioral response to having experienced trauma. It's how people tend to act. Or some people tend to act when they're trauma survivors. So we'll send some information out, and I will even say that I recommend if you and we can send out the guide to trauma-informed approaches when and a follow-up, Jordan and Megan, if you want to, from our website. But if you go to the cardiaservices.org website and search for the trauma guide there, the resources there in downloadable form and PDF. And even in that, because we created that about 5 or 6 years ago, doesn't have anything in there about fawning. That was just not part of our content when we created that. So it's a lot of people have brought it up to me in over the course of the last few years in my trainings. And so I just added that information. It's not new necessarily, but it was sort of newer for me and my content. So.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, I will wrap us up. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to send them to the updates@hcet.org that I just put in the chat. Thank you again to Stephanie and everyone for attending. We'll send that evaluation to you after this presentation. We greatly appreciate your feedback, so please fill that out for us. And if you'd like to learn even more, please consider visiting our virtual learning hub at learn.hcet.org. We've got a sexual health concepts module currently available. It's awesome. And then this LGBTQ inclusion series will be available April 13th. So keep an eye out for those. But thank you all, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much. Happy spring.